What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to Celio's Network. Today is Sunday, and the top 8 of the Limitless Qualifier 3 is probably playing out while I'm recording this video. But I wanted to talk about Pikarom as an archetype and Boltund V as a card, and kind of how I was underestimating them, or how I was evaluating the archetype as a whole, leading up to Qualifier 3, and how my opinions changed in the days prior to the tournament. And I actually shared a lot of these thoughts on my Patreon, so if you want to get these kind of thoughts like before I make these videos a couple days later, if you want to get them in real time, I do post updates before tournaments on my Patreon and stuff like that. Before we get into this video, though, shout out to PotownStore.com, the best place for you to get PTCGO codes. Use code CELIO for 5% off. And also, like I was mentioning, I do have a Patreon. The link to that is in the description down below if you want to support the channel and get some great benefits. Okay, so let's talk about Pikarom. I originally thought Pikarom was tier 2. And I thought it was a solid deck, but I didn't think it was going to be very, very popular. I didn't think it would be a deck that people kind of clung to play because they already knew it, because I thought there were much better options. And I was also underrating Boltund V as a card. But let's start with the archetype as a whole. So I did evaluate Dragapult VMAX as a tier 1 archetype. I still do think it's a tier 1 archetype. But that being said, in testing, I was using Jirachi versions or Jirachi builds of Pikarom, and that really skewed my testing results versus Dragapult VMAX decks, because the Jirachi builds of Pikarom are much weaker versus Dragapult VMAX. They're actually weaker versus the Pikarom mirrors as well, because you can start the game off by taking a 1-prize knockout on your opponent's Jirachi, and then you knock out a Boltund and a Pika, instead of having to go through 2 tag teams and a Boltund or something like that. But the Jirachi build versus Dragapult VMAX specifically is much weaker than the non-Jirachi builds, and there's multiple of them, versus Dragapult VMAX because of Dragapult's spread damage. It can snipe off a Jirachi or even multiple Jirachis to make the game much easier for them, and they take their prize cards faster and much more efficiently. And there's also some versions of Pikarom with the tag call engine, so to say, with a couple tag calls, like Guzmahala or 2, and then a Malalana or 2. And the Malalana really turns the tides of the Dragapult VMAX matchup. And the Dragapult VMAX matchup was pretty much what I was looking at. That, in addition to Baby Blounds getting a lot stronger, and Baby Blounds being a bad matchup for Pika. Also, Mill still being a viable deck, but being a little less popular, and Mill is usually a bad matchup for Pika. Mill ended up not being very successful. I believe it still saw play in a couple day 2 placements in Limitless. I'll do a full top 8 meta recap for the Limitless Q3, and I'll try to do like a whole day 2 meta recap video in the days to come. You'll be seeing that. But I underestimated Pikarom's power inherently as a deck, and also some of its matchups. And like I said, my matchup results, my testing results with Pika versus Dragapult were skewed because I was using the Jirachi build, and that turned out not to be the optimal build. So there's definitely multiple lessons to learn here about how to evaluate archetypes going into a meta. And I just assumed, since Jirachi was a consistent card, Jirachi was the way to go prior to Rebel Clash. At least in my opinion, that Jirachi would just be the best way to go. And I didn't exactly evaluate how much weight it would hold, whether you played the Jirachi version or the non-Jirachi versions, versus the mirror, and versus Dragapult VMAX specifically, like I said. Now, I did do this for other decks, like in testing Inteleon VMAX, in testing Dragapult mirrors, and testing ADPZ. If you are a patron of mine, you'll know that I was testing all of those decks with and without Jirachi. And I'll be talking about Jirachi a lot just because it is such a liability versus Dragapult VMAX, which is the shiny new card from Rebel Clash that a lot of people wanted to play, and it's very strong in addition to that. But I was testing ADPZ with and without Jirachi. I was testing Inteleon VMAX with and without Jirachi, as well as other variants. Even when I was testing Weezing Unbroken Bonds, I tested that with and without Jirachi. So I did that for other archetypes, but I do have kind of a personal bias versus Pikarom, or with Pikarom. I just have never been a huge fan of the deck. I've always felt like it was too run hot for my liking. And I've expressed that in articles on my social media on this YouTube channel. Pikarom just hasn't really been my kind of deck for a long time. I played it once at the Worlds Open this past year and got top 64. It was one of my top choices for Worlds. That's why I ended up playing it for the Open when I scrubbed out of Worlds. But other than that, I've really never played it. I've never seen much success with it. I've never considered it a deck that I would like to play, or a deck that I held in really high regard, but I've always respected its power, and it has a very, very huge cult following. There's players like Will Jenkins and Justin Bakari, that even Rahul Reddy at some points in the season, that play it for multiple tournaments and always come back to the deck as kind of a comfort pick. So I did recognize that it has a cult following. It's been a viable deck for so long, people already have the cards, but like I said, my mistake, or my overlooking or tunnel vision, whatever you want to call it, that you can take into account to learn from this, is that I did not test the optimal builds of Pikarom, and there are multiple in day 2 of the Limitless Q3. There was even a Greens Pikarom, there's Tag Call Pikarom, there's just regular Pikarom. And now that I've talked about the archetype for a good bit, and you've heard me say Pikarom and Jirachi probably 30 times each in this video, comment if you can count how many times I said Jirachi or Pikarom. Maybe I'll give you a pack or something if you win, if I have the time to count how many times I said it, but I said a lot. Yeah, leave in the comments below how many times did I say Jirachi in the video. I also underestimated Boltund V. So, I was looking at Boltund V. Now, like I said, not a Pikarom fan, so I probably didn't do my due diligence. I probably just didn't put enough time into estimating how strong these cards would be and testing them enough. But Boltund V, I did kind of like it when I tested Toxtricity VMAX for its Electrify turn 1, since Toxtricity VMAX has to evolve. But with Pikarom, I thought, you want to full blitz turn 1. That's what you're building the deck for. It kind of felt wrong to have a backup option of going for Electrify turn 1 until you realize Bolt Storm is actually insane. So if you go turn 1, get 3 energy on board with attachment Coco Prism, then you get 3 more energy on board with full blitz, and then you attach again for turn. As long as nothing got knocked out, as long as your energies didn't get disrupted, you can retreat your damaged Pika. Swing with Bolt Storm for 220 plus Electropowers. That gets knocked out, just chain another Boltund, or go into your tag team and then go into another tag team. So Boltund's actually a really, really strong and efficient attacker. It can actually do 220 on turn 2 for 1 energy if you have Thunder Mountain out. And for 1 energy on a 2-price Pokemon, if you have Thunder Mountain, you can do 220 without Electropowers being used. Of course, you can do maximum of 340 if you use all of your Electropowers that turn for just 1 energy on turn 2. So it's really, really aggressive, and that's something I didn't account for. And it also makes the prize trade really favorable when you're going Pika, then Boltund, then another Pika or an Alolan Raichu. And versus Dragapult VMAX, they can't handle taking out all of those big Pokemon when there's no Jirachi to pick off to just make the prizes more favorable to them. Because if you go Boltund and Pika versus Dragapult and you have a Jirachi on the board, that's fine. They'll just knock out your Boltund Pika and clean up a Jirachi, and they're good to go. But if there's no Jirachi, they have to clean up either another 2-prize Pokemon on the bench, or they have to kill 2 tag teams and a 2-prizer. So which can be much harder for them. And also Boltund and Pika can be really, really aggressive versus Dragapult in the early turns too. But it's not just Dragapult that matters. I think Pika is slightly favored versus ADP when ADP doesn't have Mallow and Lana, if they're not playing enough Big Charms or Frying Pans, if they're not playing Mew. But that matchup is fairly close, but it's a popular deck, and Pika is at worst, I'd say, even-ish versus ADPZ. Baby Blounds, of course, is a bad matchup, but it can still beat it. Mill is falling off, and Mill was a bad matchup for Pika. And Pika is also, I talk about this all the time, it's a deck that's already been optimized over and over. So you had people that were comfortable with the deck, you had people that were already close to having optimal lists for the decks, you had experience, you know, etc. And you're just throwing in a couple new strong cards like Boltund and the Speed Lightning Energy, which you attach and it draws you 2 cards. So this isn't really going to be a deck profile, but I do have a deck list up here, and this is a list that Stefan Ivanov shared on his Twitter sometime last week. And I really took a liking to this list. I also kind of liked a tag call version with Mallow and Lana in it, but then I realized this version could also beat Dragapult VMAX, and you don't even need the Mallow and Lana and the tag call, because you can just be aggressive and, like I said, chain the attackers in the correct order and not have a single prize Pokemon on the board that's a liability versus the Dragapult VMAXs. So I really took a liking to this list. The only thing I maybe wasn't a huge fan of was only 1 Big Charm. I think I like 2 Big Charms, but I didn't really mess with the list too much because it just felt really, really smooth and really great. So thank you, Stefan, for making a really good Pikarom list. And like I said, I will be analyzing the day 2 meta of Q3 and the top 8 of Q3, and we'll be looking at all the Pikaroms that did well that weren't this list, of course. But I just wanted to talk about how I underestimated this deck, or this archetype. I think a lot of people underestimated Pikarom, and what we can learn from this. Just, you know, if you tested out a deck and it was falling short, maybe you're not testing out the correct variant or the correct list, or maybe you're misplaying, or you have some kind of bias, or you're testing versus lists that other people aren't even going to play, that aren't going to be popular. Maybe you're testing against teched out decks, and that's not what the meta is actually going to look like. So this is just a learning experience for everyone. I'm sure I'll do it again. I'm sure you'll do it again. It's something that happens. There's always surprises. Not everybody sees it from every perspective. And it turns out Pikarom is actually really good. It was really, really popular. It was really successful this weekend. And it probably is going to be a tier 1 deck for the Rebel Clash meta, or at least very close to tier 1. So we'll have to see how that all wraps up. Tiers are arbitrary anyway. Just wanted to talk about how I underestimated Pikarom, why it's so good, show off this list a little bit. I'll put this list in the description below. Credits to Stefan. Of course, like I mentioned earlier in the video, shout out to PotownStore.com, the best place for you to get PTCGO codes. Make sure you're using code CELIO for 5% off over there. Follow me on Twitter and Twitch. Those are in the description down below, as well as the link to my Patreon if you're interested in that at all. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time here on CELIO's Network.